Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is artifact number 4 from Module 2, and today we are going to bounce all over Europe in our exploration of early medieval art and architecture. We have spent some time in the East looking at the art of the Byzantine West, and we've certainly done some things looking here at the Great Masca Carta, but we're going to go back in time now and think about some of the things that were going on in medieval Europe. Medieval is kind of a complicated phrase in a lot of ways because it involves this moment between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Renaissance. Some historians in the past have referred to this as the Dark Ages, but it's not the way we talk about this time anymore. For the things that were happening in Europe are filled with, forgive the pun, illumination. The university is born during the medieval time frame. The invention of the book in some ways in Europe is a product of the Middle Ages. And the spread of the Christian faith during this time becomes one of the major parts of the medieval world. And so we're going to begin by looking at some things that are likely not Christian in nature, but by the time we finish, we will be looking at a variety of artifacts that will bring us to the Christian faith. Some of the things that we'll talk about are here in the northern stretches of the Roman Empire, Ireland and Scotland and England. And I call your attention to this place here, Sutton Hoo, which I've always been a big fan of. We'll look at the Sutton Hoo burials. We'll spend some time here in Germany looking at Aachen and Cologne, and we'll dabble a little bit throughout France as well. So as a way of beginning there, I want to talk about the Sutton Hoo burial because it's a really important site that was discovered in the 20th century. And in it, we found a variety of really interesting artifacts. And one of those is this necklace here. This is called a torque. And a torque, and we did not look at the Dying Gaul in our exploration of Hellenistic Greek art, at least I don't remember that we did, but he is wearing this twisted gold necklace around his neck. And I want to talk a little bit about how this is made because it's a pretty complicated and beautiful find. Imagine you have 8 pieces of gold wire, right? So the first thing you have to do is mine iron or gold, excuse me. So you mine your gold, you refine your gold, you make wire from your gold, and then you take 8 pieces of those wire and you twist them all together until you have a single one of these coils. You then take 8 of those, you twist them together, and you have something that's both flexible, and you can bend it, but also really strong. And so, as you can see here, they've been capped with a metal rung here and on this side there. And so this is the kind of thing you can straighten out, but it will snap back. And in a lot of ways, what you're looking at here, although you didn't first realize it, is a kind of elevator cable. Like elevator cables are made with steel, cables just like this, but it's wires of steel twisted together with other wires of steel, and that sort of mega wire twisted together. It's super strong and flexible, which is really important. And so it's a really old technology and the kind of thing that people wore for millennia, including Gaul warriors, as you see here. This is the kind of object that was found in the Sutton Hoo burial. And so let's talk about Edith May Pretty, who's one of my favorite old ladies ever. This old lady was pretty fantastic because one day in 1935, she was walking around her estate in the Midlands in Great Britain. And what did she see sticking out of the ground but this like piece of wood? She didn't know what that was. And so, I don't know, the next day after tea or something, she went out there to look at it again and she began to dig and she realized that there was something buried in the ground and she didn't know what it was. And so she made a couple of inquiries, and eventually Cambridge University sent some people out to her estate to do some excavations. And what they found was one of the largest burial sites in ancient England. They found boats, they found coins, they found swords, they found purses, they found all kinds of great things. And Mrs. Pretty was pretty excited because she was pretty certain that she had hit the jackpot. And the British government said, "Well, hold on a second. That's not yours. That's ours." And she said, "It can't be yours. It's on my land." And they said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, we know, but it's ours." And she said, "Well, it can't be yours. It's mine." And they said, "No, no, no." And they called up a rule that's like a 600-year-old law that says that if someone buried something on their property as a way out of way of paying taxes, then that was subject to taxation and requisition by the Crown of England. And so let me explain this a little bit because it's kind of a fun law. The way people were taxed prior to like I almost said WD-40s. That's a lubricant. Like 1040s or the national income tax was that a tax collector would come to your house. They'd look around, see what you owned, said, "Well, you have 4 tables and 3 chairs and a really nice bed and this and that and that, and your wealth is this amount, and therefore you own this much taxes." That's how tax collecting used to happen. The tax collector came to your house. Because I'll be honest, people getting paychecks is kind of a new thing in some ways. So what happened was people would find out when the tax collector was coming and they'd go out and bury their 70-inch TV and their jewelry box and all of those things. And so a law was passed that stated that if you buried something with the idea of later retrieving it, that this was subject to taxation and the crown could take it. And so when the government found out about this burial on Edith May Pretty's site, they said, "Well, listen, this was all buried as a way of getting out of paying taxes for whoever it was that buried it. And so because of that, it's ours." And the Cambridge professor said, "Well, see, here's the thing, is there are coins from this that are way older than the British government is. So it was never part of that thing. It was part of the burial structure." And so, sure enough, as time wore on, it became remarkably clear that this was not buried as a way of getting out of paying taxes. It was a medieval burial site. And so, as a result, all of the stuff that was there, it belonged to Edith May Pretty. And Edith May Pretty sold it to the British government, and Edith May Pretty died rich. And so, what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is a medieval boat that was part of this burial structure. And I think this is a really an interesting site. So there are things that do really well being buried and things that don't do well. So anything that is organic, like leather, isn't going to last. Like my school bag is a leather bag. If I bury that in the dirt for 50 years, it's the only thing that will be left is the metal hinges. But metal will last a really long time, and so too will other parts. So what you're looking at here is a purse cover from the Sutton Hoo burial. This is essentially the lid. The bag would have been made of something leather or maybe a cloth of sorts, but that all deteriorated, and as a result, all that's left is this flap. Like, I don't expect you to get really excited about hinges, but look, those are hinges. This would have attached to something and it flipped up and it's got a little clasp here to close it. This is made out of enamel and gold. So you can think of enamel as like glass beads that are heated up to a certain high temperature with this kind of metal armature around it. These are some geometric patterns. This is a vulture eating a duck, right? You take some imagination, but duck bill, raptorial bill, claws, that does not look good for the duck. And this guy here, looks like it's a guy, right? He's got a round head. He's got a couple of legs. He's grabbing these animals essentially by the neck. And I think that's a really interesting idea because it exists in other parts of the world from thousands of years beforehand. Now, we didn't look at the bull-headed lyre from the Sumerian burial sites, but on it we have this very similar structure here. Like, I mean, art historians have called him the man of the beast. So here he is walking in profile, upper body in frontally, and he's holding these animals akin to this. Now, of course, this does not mean to suggest that whoever made the purse cover had knowledge of this, but rather that it's a visual element, that it has survived through the centuries. From the Sutton Hoo burial, we have masks and helmets. I mean, this one has ear flaps and a built-in mustache. I love it. We have belt buckles. We have like shoulder clasps. I mean, I think it's just fabulous. We have coins, which is one of the reasons we can date this. Coins, just like the change in your pocket, has a date on it. And even if it doesn't have a date, it often has a ruler on it. And so if you look at any coin cast in Great Britain from, oh gosh, like 1953 until now, it's got the same woman's head on it. Now, the head has changed over time because she used to be young and now she is not. But even if there wasn't date on it, when you found that coin 1,000 years from now, you would be able to date that coin on the basis only of the presence of that head. And so the Sutton Hoo burial provided remarkable insights into the kind of art that was made in medieval England when it was still wasn't fully Christianized just yet. The Christian faith begins to expand, and in a lot of ways, it survives. The Christian faith survives um, because of some of the really great things that are happening in the Atlantic Islands. And on my bookshelf way over there, I don't know if I can see the title, there's a book, I read it 20 years ago, if I read it a day ago, and it's called How the Irish Saved Civilization. I think that's right. And I would love to tell you that I totally believe a lot of the ideas behind this book, but there are some really interesting things that are true. So during the medieval time frame, there was in general a backlash towards almost anything that was pagan. And this pagan niche was anything from classical philosophy to all kinds of interesting academic pursuits. And so as a result, sort of like Trajan got melted down and a St. Peter got thrown on there, the same is true in the medieval world, that people began to get rid of those things and replace them with things that were Christian. But in places of England, Ireland, and Scotland, there were often dozens of what we call scriptoria. A scriptoria, as the word script might make you think, was merely a place where books were copied. These were almost always monasteries. So monasteries had monks in them. These monks wrote and could read, and they copied down diligently classical texts that survived. And some of the things we'll look at survive only because of these places. So we're gonna look at a couple of sites that have famous manuscripts named after them. So what you're looking at here is the Book of Durrow, and Durrow is in Ireland right there. So this is an image of St. Matthew from the Book of Durrow. It's an early medieval manuscript that dates from around 650, give or take. So let's talk about some of the big words I just threw around, like manuscript. All right, manuscript, two words, manu, scriptus. Manu involves manual, right, by hand. Script is writing, so it's handwritten. And not everything was handwritten, right? There were some things that were typed or stamped. Movable type is later. It's a development of the 15th century. But this is a manuscript, and it's made on vellum. Vellum is a kind of calfskin that is the paper upon which the pigment is applied. So this is relatively small. So maybe 8 inches by 5 inches. And on it, we have this decorative border around this image of St. Matthew. And this is a kind of, well, it's an interesting image of St. Matthew. Um, it looks as if he's wearing a snuggie or a kind of cloak that also has been broken down into geometric patterning. He has two little itty bitty legs and feet that stick out of it, but his upper body has largely been rendered, um, well, like it's a fudgesicle. And so I often like this. I once described it as a fudgesicle, and one of my students made St. Matthew as a fudgesicle. So he looks kind of odd, maybe not exactly like a human figure. And not that any of you are Shakespeare fans like I am, and I apologize for this horrible picture that I took off of my TV a few years ago. But in Franco Zeffirelli's Hamlet from 1990, the one that stars Mel Gibson, there is a version of this in Gertrude's bedroom. The only difference is this is enormous and this is tiny. Now, St. Matthew is going to have a hard time being a gospel writer because, according to this image, he has no hands. This is an abstract rendering of this figure. It's not a realistic rendering, but it is a common way in which Matthew is shown. Let's talk about the value of this object, because you and I think about paper and ink in a slightly different way in which the medieval world was. This isn't made with paper. This is made on vellum, and vellum is calfskin. And if you're using a calf, if you're using the hide of the calf for paper upon which to paint, you can't let that calf grow up to be a big cow and then really eat it. Right? Cows are marvelous because they get big and then you can eat them. But calves are small. There's not a lot of meat there, but they make for the best writing surface. So when we look at these manuscripts, the value of the materials is very much part of the value of the object. The inks are made from precious, ground up precious stones that they then add a pigment, a liquid to provide a sense of binder. The pages, the supports upon which these things are placed are also enormously valuable. I mean, and the time meant creating them is not in the matter of days or weeks, but rather years. So these objects are remarkably valuable and treasured by the monasteries that own them. You can see that this is a single page illustration, and off on the side here you can see there's another page, the facing page, that has text on it. If this dates from 675, give or take, we will see a couple of versions of Matthew that will change over time. And so I want to show you some manuscripts and talk about the progression of form in them as a way of speaking more broadly about the medieval world. So this is another Saint Matthew. It's from the Lindisfarne Gospel, again, part of the Atlantic Islands, and this dates from around 50 years later. This is the same deal. It's tempera on parchment, tempera on vellum, and in this instance, we have Matthew seated, actually writing. And when we looked at the art, when we looked at Galla Placidia a long time ago, it seems like, I mentioned to you that our gospel writers have different allegorical symbols, and that the allegorical symbol for St. Matthew was a man, right? So here is the ceiling vault of that, and here was St. Matthew. He was shown as a man. So we have other gospel writers that are often shown in slightly different kinds of ways. Here Matthew is shown seated on a bench as if he is writing. Let me go back to him. I call your attention to this bench, and it's maybe not the kind of thing you would necessarily pay attention to, but that bench is angling back into space. And this is an attempt, in a way that is not present here on the left, of recreating three-dimensional space on something that is flat. This goes back this way. There's a certain distance in space, three-dimensional space, from this edge of it here and the edge that's back there that you cannot see. Matthew is labeled Matthias, And remember, I mentioned to you, Hagia is the word for holy. So this provides his title, St. Matthew. And here you can see a representation of a man who is our allegorical symbol for St. Matthew. So very quickly, we go from no interest in three-dimensional space to at least a passing attempt at that. And this progression is something that is very, very important. Also from the Lindisfarne's Gospels is this. It is a Christian cross. It is called a carpet page, which merely means to suggest that it has been decorated to such an extent that it looks as if it is a kind of rug, like an oriental rug. It's a Latin cross, which has two arms, a longer arm that's bisected 2/3 of the way up with a shorter arm. The Lindisfarne Gospel is a little bit bigger than the Book of Durrow. It's probably 16 by 12, so it's a significantly bigger version. And we will see this size be pretty typical throughout the medieval period. These are Gospels. They were read from during the course of the Christian Mass. And one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts is that of the Book of Kells. And when you go visit the Book of Kells, and you should, it's in a very small little dark room, and they change the page like once every 2 weeks. I went and saw it twice, 10 days apart, hoping to see a different page the second time I went. I did not. The Book of Kells is really fabulous because it's remarkably decorated. The text is beautiful. And at the beginning of it, they have what we call canon tables. And a canon table is a device that allows a reader of the scripture to go back and forth between the same story in different gospels. So imagine, I don't know, the part of Christ's ministry from the Sermon on the Mount that shows up in at least 3 of the Gospels, and a canonical table will tell you in the book of Luke, it's this chapter. In the book of John, it's this chapter and verse. And in Matthew, it's this chapter and verse. It's actually very, very helpful. This over here is a depiction of Mary and a very frightening little baby Jesus. But of all of the Book of Kells, this is the most famous. It's called the Chi Rho Iota page. And it is merely the first couple letters of the book of John, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see we have a chi and a rho, right? The first 2 letters of Christ. And over here is the iota. There you go. And then underneath it is this H generatio, which is short for autumn generatio, which is the beginning of that gospel. This is how the birth of Christ came to be. On the page that's over here would have been the beginning of that gospel. But this is a kind of drop cap, right? A drop cap is if you look at sort of like old school books and the first letter of a paragraph was bigger, that was called a drop cap. And this is that same idea. And think about all of the decoration that's present here merely to get us to the book, the beginning of that gospel. The whole thing is decorated, and extravagantly so. And I mentioned to you when looking at Islamic architecture that there is a sense of horror vacui, the fear of blank spaces, that they looked at this and thought, oh my goodness, there's a blank space here. Let's put in some other geometric patterning to fill it up. And that's very much a part of this object. One last page from the Book of Kells for you. Really, really fabulous. And these things are alive. It's sort of like a notebook that they get added to over time. They're not static. It would be like, when I was a PhD student studying for my doctoral exams, all I did was read stuff for 6 months. I wasn't in classes. I just read everything ever written about the kinds of things I wanted to write on. And some of those articles I first read back in the spring of 2003, I still have those. I go back to those articles and read them again. And now when you look at them, I can see different colored ink because first time I read it, I was reading with black ink, and now I have a blue ink pen, and then there's red ink. And it's sort of this, you can track my changes, what I think about something over time. These are the same way that they often have annotations to them, which I think is pretty fabulous. I give you a map that we looked at before, and I want to call your attention to this place here. Aachen might not be a place you've ever heard of before, but around the year 800, Aachen was a happening and hopping place, and it was very much the center of the world of the Franks, Franks, and the leader of the Franks was a guy named Charles the Great, or as you and I would call him, Charlemagne. Charlemagne. And you know by now that I'm not a big date guy, but I'll give you another date. First date I gave you, the Edict of Milan in 313. That's the year when the Christian faith became an acceptable form of faith in the Roman Empire. Here's the second date I care enough about to mention it specifically, and that is Christmas Day 800. Christmas Day 800. On this day, Charlemagne had come all the way from Aachen to Rome. To give you an idea of scale, that's a big Rome trip, big road trip. He'd come all the way from Aachen to Rome, stopped in Ravenna on the way, and upon the door of Old St. Peter's, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. This is a big deal because what we have now for the first time in the West is we have a Christian ruler in Europe. He's made Holy Roman Emperor. This title survives until the 19th and some would suggest the 20th century. This is a big deal. He now sees himself as not just a ruler, but a ruler of a Christian land. And this is a relatively small statue of him on a horseback. It might remind you a little bit of the equestrian monument we looked at of Marcus Aurelius. And like Marcus Aurelius, he is shown enormous on this pony. Again, I've never been on a horse before, but the horse is bigger than me, and this Charlemagne is either an 8'10" giant or he's riding a pony. In one hand, he's holding a bronze ball that symbolizes his rulership over the earth. Now, Charlemagne has a couple of cool things going for him, and one of those things is Charlemagne invents lowercase handwriting. Now, to be honest, Charlemagne doesn't invent lowercase writing. It's developed in his court while he is the ruler there, but it's hard to overstate what a great thing lowercase writing is, to say nothing of something that you and I would call punctuation. Think about what lowercase writing does for us. Lowercase writing signifies usually the end of a sentence when we have a capital word. In the English language, certain kinds of nouns are capitalized. We call those proper nouns. But it makes reading things a lot easier. And prior to Charlemagne, lowercase writing doesn't exist. I mean, if you were to go back and relook at the inscription on the Pantheon, those are all uppercase letters. There's no lowercase Roman letters. It's only with Charlemagne that we begin to see that. So the lowercase writing allows for an ease in the transcription of the written word, and this is a really important thing. This is a diagram of a scriptoria. This is from Spain, of all places. But here we have two monks copying something down. So it's in the court of Charlemagne that we have the development of lowercase writing and then also the development of punctuation in a real and practical sense of the word, and that's a really important idea. Christmas Day 800 is the crowning of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor, and this object is called the Coronation Gospels. It was found in Charlemagne's sarcophagus, and it has traditionally been dated to 800. When he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And once again, my friends, look at this. I give you Saint Matthew. Here he is sitting on a stool, writing at a lectern with either the rising sun or the biggest halo ever around him. This has been called the Coronation Gospels because we believe that it was created in honor of the coronation of Charlemagne. And one of the reasons people believe that is because of the rich purple color, that imperial color that shows up around all over this object. Now, here's this image of good old St. Matthew. And aside from having slightly yellow eyes, as if he's like a night walker or something from Game of Thrones, he's been shown calm and almost Greek-like in his representation. I don't mean to suggest that there's a great development of three-dimensional space, but you can see that he's holding a quill. Over here, he has an inkwell. It's actually an inkhorn. And here he is writing this object. Think about how different this St. Matthew is from St. Matthew the Fudgesicle. And even this St. Matthew, who's been shown a little bit different. Like, these are very different representations of St. Matthew, to say nothing of this, which was from which it was borrowed from, it seems to me. So this is another manuscript from Germany, maybe 75 years beforehand. But this St. Matthew seems calm, relaxed, and peaceful compared to this St. Matthew. My goodness, this Matthew. Look at this guy. Now, there's a full disclosure. I've never actually taken an art class. I can't draw. I have no talent. I'm a historian. But when I looked at this, maybe the first time I ever saw it when I was an undergraduate student, I thought of a later artist, because there are some ways in which there are elements and principles of design that are consistent throughout time, right? Color, balance, line. And so this object has a very keen interest in line to it. And there is an artist working primarily in France at the end of the 19th century who also puts a keen interest in line, and his name was, wait for it, Van Gogh. Now, please know, I'm not saying that Van Gogh knew about the Ebo Gospels that you're looking at here on the right-hand side. I mean to suggest that both artists, whoever made the manuscript and Van Gogh himself, used line as a way of conveying something. So I want you to imagine that you're at your desk writing one night, and what you begin to hear is the voice of God. Don't you think that's going to like have an effect upon your level of your mental well-being? Like, this is a remarkably animated, give me another cup of coffee kind of St. Matthew. Here he sits at this lectern holding a quill in his right hand and an inkhorn in this hand. And this is a no more caffeine, thank you very much kind of Matthew. This is a moment of divine inspiration, but if you're writing down the words of God, don't you think you have to be really careful not to mess it up? I mean, he's worried. It looks like he's perspiring. There's a sense of frenetic energy about this object, and it exists not only in his face, but also in the background as well. I mean, we have this kind of frenetically composed like temple, almost looks like a pagoda in the background. And one of the things you might not have noticed at first is up here in the corner, we have that man, the symbol of St. Matthew here, and there's words spilling into the ink pot. You can sort of see it there sort of coming in. Like, this is a worried Matthew, and all of the gospel writers are worried, right? Here is St. Mark. You can see his lion there. And of course, Luke as well, with the ox likewise as worried. And just to bring us all the way home, St. John and the eagle up in this corner. If you're writing down the words of God, there's a remarkable pressure in getting things right. And this shows a very different side. So we've looked at some different gospels, right? And everything from Matthew being a frozen dessert treat to this one where it looks like he has had way too much caffeine for his own good. These manuscripts almost always deserve really fancy book covers, and we don't live in a book cover world anymore. I bet your teachers, at least I did, my parents did, would often put covers on their books. Like they would cover them with like paper bags, like folded around the back cover, and they could decorate all of that. This is how the medieval Christians rolled. This is the Lindau Gospels, and this is from the Carolingian period. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but when we're dealing with things from Charlemagne's time frame, right? It's Carolingian. That's where we get Charlemagne from, or we get Carolingian from Charlemagne. So all of these are from the Carolingian period, right, within the medieval world. And this is a great example of a book cover during this time frame. And I gotta tell you, it looks pretty different, doesn't it? Like this is a very interesting book cover. It's made with gold, rubies, sapphires, pearls, all gems, and all kinds of fancy jewelry. And it was made around 970. And I call your attention to this Jesus. I mean, you can see he's got a little bit of blood squirting out of his hands here, there, and there. And I ask you to look upon his face, and I say to you, how do you think his day is going? Because it seems to me that all things considered, things ain't going so bad for Jesus. This might remind you of some of the crucifixions we looked at earlier, right? When we looked at the 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 little ivory that's carved. This is a pain-free, no problem kind of Christ. And this dates around 870. And in about 100 years, this is going to change. Wanted to show you a work of architecture before we wrap things up for the day. And this is the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne. It dates, like everything in the Carolingian period, around 800. And I wanted to show you this and then show you this and say, my friends, look at this. Our good boy Charlemagne has brought back a good idea. So let me go back here to our map. Here's our map. Here's where Charlemagne goes. He goes to Rome. Here's where Charlemagne is from. He's from Aachen. And if you're making that big road trip and you're not going by 737, you're going overland. And one of the places we know he goes to is Ravenna. And when he goes to Ravenna, he went and saw what I saw in Ravenna, and that was San Vitale. And look at the relationship between these two structures. They are, in many ways, they're cousins, aren't they? And this becomes Charlemagne's small private chapel in Aachen. Aachen is, to this day, it's pretty tiny. And I went there with my German tutor's little sister, who I'll show you in a little while when we talk about Cologne. But we went there and looked at all of this. And it is this cool little gem of a chapel. Charlemagne's sarcophagus is still there, although he's no longer in it. And look at this, my friends. We have that element of Islamic architecture working its way into Christian architecture as well. This dates from 800. And this, as a Palatine chapel, was intended primarily for Charlemagne and his court. The word Palatine, we take the word palace. So this was not intended for you and I, and we'll look at other Palatine chapels in due time. This was just for Charlemagne and his court. It's small, just like San Vitale is small as well. And so this was a small Palatine chapel, and we will have the opportunity to look at others in due time. But what's important for this is we're beginning to see the relationship between Islamic and Christian architecture go both ways. Clearly, Islamic architecture is influenced by Christian architecture, and now the opposite will be true. While we wrap up, I'll give you a Brian Zygmunt fun fact, or travel tip, I should say. When you go to Aachen, and you should, please do not drink the water. You can drink the tap water, that's fine. but there is naturally occurring hot springs in Aachen. It's one of the reasons why Aachen existed in the first place. There were hot springs there. So, kind of like at Yellowstone National Park, right? There's underground geysers that eventually spit up hot water, and so there are naturally occurring hot springs there. And those hot springs are fueled by sulfur, and sulfur water has a very distinctive aroma to it. Sulfur sort of smells like rotten eggs. And so when you walk by the center part of Aachen, those hot springs are still there. And I was there with Carolyn. We went on a sort of day trip. Carolyn was from Cologne. It was maybe an hour drive. And Carolyn spoke perfect English. My German is not very good. And there were some old German men sitting around this hot spring, this fountain. And they called us over, and I must have been, this was 2002, so I was maybe 20, not quite 27, just barely 26. And they said to me in very broken English, "Live long like me, drink water." And so they pointed to the water, and they were all drinking this water. And Carolyn was sort of translating their broken English and said, they claim that the reason why they will live so long is because they drink the fountain water, the spring water. And she said they would like you to drink it. And I was like, I don't think so. No, thank you. And they insisted. And so inevitably, I did have a small taste of the sulfur um, spring water, and it tasted about as bad as you would expect sulfur water to taste. But those hot springs, which have been around for 2,000 years, are still creating hot sulfur mineral water that is keeping that vibrant town alive. When Charlemagne dies, the leadership of the Holy Roman Empire goes to his sons and grandsons, and that is where we will pick up next time.